Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly monumental shift happening right now in Mexico's infrastructure and legal landscape. I'm so excited to walk you through this historic constitutional reform because it's fundamentally changing how Mexico manages its railways. For decades, the focus has basically been entirely on moving cargo, but now the pendulum is swinging back. We are looking at a massive legal pivot designed to finally put passenger trains back on the tracks.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the law itself, I want you to consider this number, less than 1%. In 2022, out of a staggering 3.455 billion domestic passenger trips in Mexico, a shocking 0.9% were made by rail. That tiny, almost non-existent fraction proves just how rare passenger trains have become for the everyday citizen. They've largely been reduced to just a handful of tourist routes and highly isolated local services.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, Mexico's railway history. 2. The modern mobility gap. 3. Reforming Article 28. 4. Unpacking the legal changes. And 5. The future of rail.
Let's start with Section 1, Mexico's railway history, which has really been a pendulum of change.
To truly grasp the weight of this new reform, you have to understand that Mexican railway policy has seen some dramatic swings over the years. Back in 1937 and 1938, President Lázaro Cárdenas established the state's rectory over the railways, basically nationalizing them to drive regional development. And for nearly 60 years, the state ran the whole show. But then, fast forward to 1995, and a major legal reform completely pivoted the country toward privatization. The government handed out private concessions covering roughly 84.5% of the main tracks, shifting the focus almost entirely to profitable freight and cargo. And the result for the infrastructure itself? Well, from that privatization in 1995 all the way up to 2017, the national rail network grew by a meager 23 kilometers. It just completely stalled out at a total length of 26,914 kilometers.
Moving on to Section 2, the modern mobility gap, and how we ended up with such a skewed transport system. So the real-world consequence of that 1995 privatization was a massive, glaring disparity in national mobility. As you can see, highway passengers completely dominate the pie right now, accounting for a massive 93.6%. Rail cargo takes up a respectable 5.5% of the transport sector, but rail passengers, again, relegated to that tiny 0.9% sliver. The entire national transport system became incredibly reliant on roads and buses, while passenger rail faded into the background.
Actually, if that 0.9% passenger share wasn't surprising enough, get this. Of that tiny fraction of people who are actually taking a train, 99.24% of them are riding just one single service, the Ferrocarriles Suburbanos, which is a suburban train system. So when we say there's a lack of national passenger rail, we mean it's virtually non-existent outside of this one very specific metropolitan commute.
Which brings us to Section 3, Reforming Article 28, or Changing the Constitution. Now, this immense mobility gap is exactly what the executive branch sought to fix, and they aimed straight at the highest law of the land to do it. Looking at the primary source document for this reform, the executive lays out a very clear justification. Their core argument is that the state needs to consolidate its rectoria, meaning its guiding authority and control, in strategic areas to ensure economic development and social cohesion. Basically, their rationale is that relying purely on highways and buses just isn't enough for a growing nation anymore. By stepping back in to prioritize passenger trains, the government argues they can connect remote regions, stimulate local economies, and offer safer, way more sustainable travel options.
But here is what is truly fascinating about this: the political reaction. When this reform hit the Chamber of Deputies, the legislative consensus was absolute. We are talking 472 votes in favor, 0 against, and 0 abstentions. Regardless of their political affiliations, every single voting representative agreed on this constitutional change. It's incredibly rare to see such a unanimous mandate, and it really highlights a shared, cross-party recognition that passenger rail desperately needs a massive revival in Mexico.
All right, let's look at Section 4, Unpacking the Legal Changes and Analyzing the Decree.
Riding on that overwhelming support, the October 30, 2024 decree targets Article 28 of the Constitution with two major actions. First, it reforms Paragraph 4, officially reestablishing railways as a priority area for national development and explicitly prioritizing the transport of passengers over cargo. This is a total reversal of the trend we've seen since 1995. Second, it adds a brand new Paragraph 5. This addition gives the executive federal power to grant assignments to public companies or concessions to private parties specifically for passenger rail. Essentially, it builds out the legal toolkit the government needs to get trains running again, whether they use state-owned enterprises or private partnerships.
The absolute heart of this legal shift is captured perfectly in this exact addition to Article 28. The Mexican state resumes the right to use railway tracks to provide passenger transport service. That's the core of it, right there. The state is no longer going to act as just a passive landlord of the tracks. It is actively taking back its right to ensure those tracks are used to move people, not just freight.
And finally, Section 5, the future of rail. What happens next? So, the Constitution is officially amended, but the obvious question is how a legal victory actually translates into physical trains on physical tracks. The constitutional reform was really just the starting gun. Moving forward from its publication on October 30, 2024, the Congress of the Union has exactly 180 days to adjust the secondary laws, specifically the regulatory law of railway service. That's step 1. Step 2 involves creating a much denser regulatory framework that dictates exactly how passenger trains will be prioritized on tracks that are currently dominated by heavy, slow cargo trains. And step 3? That's where the rubber meets the road. Or, well, the steel meets the track. The government has to assign massive, serious budgets and execute concrete network plans. Because without the funding and the blueprints, the law remains just ink on paper.
As they build out this new framework, legal analysts and policymakers are looking outward for inspiration. The goal of this reform is to emulate highly successful international passenger rail models, specifically looking at places like the European Union, China, and Japan. They want to transition Mexico towards a passenger mobility network that is agile, safe, modern, and capable of moving millions of people efficiently, just like we see in those leading regions.
Which leaves us with one final, very big question. Will secondary laws and future budgets be enough to trigger a new golden age of passenger trains in Mexico? The absolute legislative consensus was a historic first step, no doubt, but rebuilding a national railway network is easily one of the most complex infrastructure challenges a country can ever undertake. The legal foundation is now officially set in stone. Now, we wait to see if the tracks, the trains, and the funding will actually follow. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes on the rails